So good afternoon, everybody. A warm welcome to this afternoon's webinar on effective three-way contracting. So my name is Liz Palmer. I'm a partner at Catalyst Wonfor. And today I'm going to be in conversation with my very dear friend and colleague, Damion Wonfor, who, as many of you know, is the founder of Catalyst Wonfor. So as Damion said, it's really lovely to see so many familiar names and faces. Well, we can't see you, but familiar people joining the call. And also welcome to those of you who perhaps haven't joined us before. It's lovely to have you with us as well for the afternoon. So as Damion said, the call is going to be about 45 minutes. So for those of you who are needing to get away. So just before we talk a little bit about what we're going to cover, let me just do a few housekeeping points. So the first thing is that we are going to record the webinar. So if you want to catch up with it later, it'll be on our YouTube channel. It can be useful to have a pen and paper to hand, just in case you need to jot things down as we go along. We will keep everybody on listen mode. So if there are questions or reflections or insights that you would like to share, we'd love to see them. So just put them into the chat panel and we'll do our best to make sure we cover as many of the questions as we can. I'm sure all of you are familiar with working virtually, so if you can shut down any applications, that will really help the transmission speed at your end. And as I said, we're going to take about 45 minutes. So today's conversation on three-way contracting has really come about as a result of sort of ongoing conversations that Damion and I have with delegates on our coach training programs and also with people who are in supervision with us. And so we thought it would be worthwhile to really take the time just to explore the topic of three-way contracting, particularly from the perspective of how to make it a really effective conversation, and perhaps to touch on what's really important about it and what the impact of it is and can be on the effectiveness of the coaching relationship. So before we start, actually, we'll just have a pause just to give you a chance for yourselves to think about what's going to make this a really valuable time for you this afternoon. So perhaps just to capture what are the key questions perhaps you're holding about this, that it would be useful for you to have answered. And also just to think about perhaps some insights that you've already had about it. So just take a couple of minutes to do that. And if you can share some of those on the chat panel, that would be really helpful for us too, so that, as I said, we know that we are answering some of those questions that you might have. So we'll just give you another minute or so so that you can capture some of those things and share some of those things. So thank you, Mike. So things to focus on to get it right. And also I like your phrase, gotchas to look out for. So we will be covering perhaps some of the challenges that we can face when being in these conversations. And from David as well, our three-way conversation is always needed. So again, we'll be touching on when we might do them, and at what stage in the coaching relationship we might do it as well. So yep, some themes coming out about, are they always needed? Should I be encouraging organizations to engage in contracting? So again, we'll be touching on the benefits for doing it. And also a question from Kim, thank you, about the role the coach plays in three-way contracting. So lovely questions, thank you for sharing those. And also questions about actually the value of finishing with a three-way conversation as well. So thank you, David. And yes, we'll be covering that too. And one from Sarah as well about when the third party or the line manager might have different expectations than the coachee. So yes, so all things that we'll be covering in the conversation today, and all very similar questions to the ones that we get from people who are in training with us or in supervision. So thank you for sharing those. So as a starting point, I think it would be good just to start with perhaps asking Damion, what's the purpose of three-way contracting? So when you think about it.
Thanks, Liz. I just wanted to add another piece to this as well, because I think in terms of as an industry, again, we're seeing questions being raised around the value of coaching, and does coaching actually deliver and meet expectations. And I just wanted to reflect actually about an experience I had when I was in a corporate role, and I used to manage an executive coaching pool. And at that point, the organization was making a significant investment in external coaching. And this is about 15, 18 years ago at least, just really the sort of turn of the early 2000s. And I was getting questions around, so what's the value of coaching? Because at that point in the organization I was working in, coaching did happen behind closed doors in a way, and it's a famous saying about coaching. And one of the things that I introduced was three-way contracting. And, I'd say it took about 6 to 8 months. But the impact of that from an organizational perspective was they stopped asking, so the senior leaders, the exec team stopped asking questions about the value that they were getting from coaching, because they were part of it. And I think, in terms of, if there's anybody listening that's part of an internal coaching pool, I think this is one of the ways that you can really demonstrate the value of coaching. And I think internal coaching pools often overlook the impact of this, as well as external coaches as well.
So something in that, Damion, I think the phrase we often use in our conversations is it's almost like an anchor point for the coaching. So it helps the organisation and the coachee feel like whatever's being worked on is firmly anchored in the organisation.
Yeah, completely. And I think we'll come on and talk about I suppose our responsibility in this as well, because when we think about contracting and the one of the elements of the three-way meeting is to contract effectively with the coachee and the sponsor. And we'll talk about other aspects of the three-way in a moment, but when we think about contracting and that critical conversation that we're having with our coachees around the program goals, what we're there to do in terms of what they're trying to achieve in their leadership, because coaching is about impacting their leadership in the organization. We think about process and logistics, as you can see on the screen, and then the critical piece around the expectations that we have of each other, the coach and the coachee, and the psychological contract. And a lot of the coaches that I supervise, often in supervision, they will talk to me about the coaching program feeling unanchored, actually, and quite often in terms of perhaps that what they're challenging the coachee around in terms of their leadership. There's a sense of there's some missing information, actually. And I think, in terms of the value that we get from holding these conversations is really, the reality that, we're engaging the coaching in the wider context of the leader's work. So when we think about the three-way, it may be more than a three-way. It could be a four-way. There might be other stakeholders that need to be engaged in the process. So the organisation really are able to input into the focus of the coaching, because the reality is, yes, coaching can be about personal development for the leader, but it's so much more than that. We're trying to impact the leader in their leadership practice. And of course, to do that properly, we need to make sure that the leader is supported. So, in terms of the three-way, we often think about contracting, we think about the goals, but it's so much more than that in terms of really setting the coaching up to succeed, actually.
So like you, I'm really hearing that the point about value, of allowing organisations and the coaches to really have a sense of the value of the coaching intervention. So what would you say about your experience of some more of the benefits of engaging in three-way contracting?
Yeah, and I think part of the training that we do with coaches, we're often saying to them, part of your role is to educate the coachee how to be coached, and I think Gary raised it on one of the questions or reflections earlier. Part of our role is also to educate the organisation. So, part of setting the contracting up is the consultancy piece that goes on. In terms of the benefits, I just wanted to show this model, which is in the course materials for our courses around contracting, and it's just this idea of psychological distance and thinking about these three players in the coaching, so the coach, the coachee, and the organisation. So that could be, the coachee's line manager, it could be the HR. There's a sense here that we're trying to have a transparent conversation that means that we can be equal distance from these different parties, because quite often, and there were some reflections on this again in the chat, I might be contacted by the organisation and they start to download information about the leader that they want me to work with. So already that arrow at the top of this model is starting to decrease because I'm invited to step closer to the organisation. And Liz and I will have a stock phrase which we would use, which is, please don't share anything with me that you're not comfortable sharing in front of the coachee, as a way of sort of trying to put a boundary around that initial conversation. But I think one of the benefits that we see is that we're able to manage this map a lot more effectively. And, think of it as preparing the ground. If we don't do this, often we get pulled into some ethical dilemmas and some challenges where we're starting to be pulled into conversations, or perhaps we're being asked for feedback. Perhaps we're being fed information about the coachee. And sometimes, again, it could be that we're moving closer to the coachee. There's that sort of sense of, well, how do we remain in that objective place, actually? So that's one of the benefits. I'll share some more benefits in a moment.
And that's really helpful, because Kimberly, I know one of the things you posted is that challenge, as you said, that you've come across, of when you're being fed information that then might, as you say, colour the interaction with the coachee. So as Damion said, it's really important to create some boundaries for yourself around how you're interacting with the sponsor in it, and to feel that you can be, we always use the phrase, you manage the process. So to really feel that this is part of the process that you're managing, and that you can set some clear boundaries around that. So actually, I was just going to share, I remember using this model because I was feeling with my coachee very distant from the organisation. So, and it really helping me understand as the coach, actually, that, and it was sort of me sort of really raising with the coachee, I think we need to have a three-way, because this needs to be anchored back into the organisation. So it's a really helpful model. If you're ever having that sense of what might be going on here, this can be a useful model to use for your own reflections about where, what's the distance between you and the organisation and you and the coachee. So what are some of the other key benefits?
Yeah, well, I thought it'd be interesting to just move on to show this, actually. So this goes back to some research that I was carrying out, but it was back in 2005. So, it's a bit old now, but my honest, I suppose, experiences, I'm not sure if things have moved on that much. So this research I carried out with 20 organizations. They were global organizations, and they were using coaching. They've been, I suppose, using coaching as an intervention for at least 10 years. And I was just interested in what were the reasons why that they were using three-way contracting, and what were the reasons why they weren't. And this is some of the areas that we got coming out. So you can sort of see in terms of what some of the benefits are. Well, again, I suppose it links back to my experience. A number of them reported that it does create a belief from the business in the value of coaching, rather than just talking, because often we're talking about a return on expectation rather than a return on investment. The goals of the individual are aligned with the line manager, and we'll talk a bit about private and public goals in a short while. Organizational support. So I think that's one of the key benefits, because the line manager is engaged in the process. And the reality is sometimes it may not be the line manager if the relationship isn't strong enough. So sometimes we might have a HR representative as a sponsor. Some of the other value for the coach, we start to get more information. And we also understand really what's really happening for the coachee and the line manager in terms of their role. Yeah, so I think the whole sort of clarity of business perspective. And then we start to see some reasons why, or some challenges around why it doesn't happen. So some organizations sort of really believing around the confidentiality, and there can still be that. We're talking about public goals, public expectations between the organization, the coach and the coachee. So there can still be private goals between the coach and the coachee that stay confidential, but they will be still aligned to that leader's work. So you can start to see here some of the reasons why, and some of the reasons they weren't. Out of the 20 organizations that I spoke to at that point, only 50% of them were using three-way contracting. And I think, again, sometimes as the coach, it may not be appropriate to do this, and we'll talk about when to use this. But I think as well, sometimes we really have to hold our authority. And if this is part of our practice, this is something that we have to normalize for the organization and the coachee and the line manager, actually. And we'll talk about how to prepare people for this in a short while as well. So I suppose there's some of the benefits that I would sort of list.
And again, I'm really sort of hearing in what you're saying, there are times when, as the coach, it might be that I'm the one who is advocating for this, and having that real sense of, because I know that the value it can bring, or the importance of it, as you say, for all of those reasons, but the importance of it in really supporting both the coachee and the organisation in getting the most from it. And actually, certainly looking at the reported reasons for, one of the things that really comes up for me is around the support for the coachee, because that, for me, one of the really key conversations, and I know we'll come on to this, is around how the line manager or the HR manager can support and give feedback to the coachee, which is a really valuable conversation for both parties to have.
Yeah, that idea of feed forward, let's use a bit of a jargon word, but the idea actually, as a result of three-way, the line or the HR, are available to provide feedback on the change that they're noticing. So I just got a couple of other slides that I wanted to share, actually, just around benefits and what happens in reality. So the other part of the research I carried out in 2005 was actually to look at an actual program where there were a number of leaders that were being coached in a global organization, and they were attending a talent program. And so, because of my relationship with that organization, we introduced three-way goal setting at the start and at the end. And I just want to share the research that came out from this. So the coaches that were working with the organization had all been coaching from between 10 years to 25 years. So they were quite experienced as coaches. And as a result of the three-way goal setting, I wanted to understand initially their perceived or their perceptions around the impact of this in terms of what would happen, because for a lot of them, they hadn't done it. So what you can sort of see on the screen there is the results. Really, 66% of the coaches were up for trialing this and actually being involved, but there were a number that actually said that they weren't happy to do it. And you can sort of see the reasons around what they were expecting to happen, such as the impact on the coachee's openness, the trust, confidentiality, etc. So, I mean, with the people that weren't interested in being involved, they didn't take part in the actual process. And there was around about 18 leaders that were actually involved in the coaching process, and then their line manager was engaged in the three-way contracting. So I went in afterwards, so it was about a year after the coaching had actually started, to evaluate what was the impact from the coachees and the line manager's perspective, actually, in terms of when we introduced three-way goal setting. So you can see here from the coachees' perspective, what was the positive or the negative impact of having three-way goal contracting conversations in place. And actually 100% reported back that it had a positive impact on the coaching, both for the coachee, the line manager, and the coach. Actually, there was a lot of conversations around the impact it had for the coach to be more effective in the coaching. But again, you can sort of see some ways that it impacted the coachee. One of my reflections that I often have with coachees after we're having a three-way meeting and the line manager or the HR person has left, and the coachee will often turn around to me and say, well, I wish I'd known that earlier, because often they have a very open or transparent conversation with the line manager when the coach is there, and the expectations that the line manager is sharing. So I think, in terms of the leader really having clarity on expectations, that's definitely one of the benefits that I see. So if you are working with any leaders that are in transition, I'd really encourage you to introduce this as part of your practice. So that was the coachee's perspective. The line managers, again, there were no reported negative impacts of three-way. Actually, they were all positive in terms of the value that they saw that the three-way contracting conversations brought, as well as the review meetings at the end. So again, just to sort of show the value on this in terms of real cases, this is what we saw.
So on that, Damion, so really conscious, and I'm sure some of the people listening in will have experienced this, that sometimes the coachee can be quite anxious about the idea of having a conversation with their line manager. From your experience, what have you found is helpful in those situations?
I think, and again, as an external coach, we need to be having conversations. If we're brought in by, say, HR, we need to do a bit of a health check about the relationship between the coachee and their line manager, because sometimes, the line manager and the coachee are in a difficult space. So actually having a three-way meeting with the line manager is not going to necessarily be, I suppose, a positive intervention. So sometimes it may mean that we bring in HR as that third person. It's really preparation. One aspect of this is normalizing it. So this is how I work as a coach, with all my clients, and these are some of the benefits that other clients have spoken to me about in terms of the three-way process. Being very clear around what will be confidential. So yes, we will have some public goals, but we will also have some private goals between us, and they will stay confidential. And I often talk to them about, the organization making the investment. So of course they want to see some return. So the public goals are one way of doing that. So in the chemistry session, really preparing the coachee for it. And as we talk about, later, this won't be the first thing that we do. So there will be some time with the coachee and the coach to really build the relationship first before the three-way is introduced. So preparing the ground, I would say, educating.
So, and this might be a useful place actually to bring in the questions. So I think, David, you raised a question about useful to finish with one. So what would you say here about just, starting one midway, one finishing? Because there are lots of different combinations, if you like, of how we can use three-way contracting.
Yeah. I think, of course, we need to bear in mind how long the coaching program is. If it's only 3 or 4 sessions, for me, I would have a three-way meeting up front and a review meeting. I wouldn't be worrying about a midpoint. If we have one up front, we're doing 6 sessions, and then we agree the coaching will continue, we would, on the 6th session, have a mid-way meeting with the line. If it's 8 sessions, we might have a mid-meeting 4 sessions in. I think ABC of coaching always be contracting. Sometimes we might contract with a coachee that will have 1, 2, maybe even 3 sessions before we introduce the 3-way. So if they're new to coaching, sometimes we may need to do a bit of work first. So I think there's also, of course, the stakeholder to bear in mind. And sometimes if they're bringing you in to do the work, or perhaps you're an internal coach and they're contacting you and saying, look, we really need your support with a leader, I would say you definitely need to do this as soon as possible. So I suppose there's no rule of thumb. I mean, sometimes, it doesn't always happen. Some of the organizations I work with, even though I've contracted with them to do this, they're not interested because they see coaching as a development intervention for the leader. And I think that's quite sad, but that's their choice, that's their investment. If that's the case, I would still be having questions around the contract with the coachee around, so what would the organization want you to achieve from this? What's important in terms of how you're behaving as a leader, and what would the organization say how they would want you to be behaving different at the end, Yeah. So, I think there's no rule of thumb, is what I'm going to say.
That's what I was really hearing. There's no hard and fast rule. There is something, I think, in what you're saying around what my own sense of my professional practice is, and therefore what I'm going to be advocating for with the clients. And then there's also the bit I think we touched on a bit earlier about when I might find myself in a situation where, on reflecting on that model of coachee organisation, I might have a sense that I need to suggest that we bring something in.
And I think most of the supervision conversations I've had with coaches, when they knew it was the right thing to do and they didn't do it, and then they were halfway through, 2/3 of the way through, really realizing that that was a critical piece that was missing, because the coachee is not really understanding why the organization is asking them to have coaching. It just stops us from being used as a mouthpiece for the organization, actually.
Okay, so it might be useful, I think, to just move on perhaps to how would I do it? So if it's something that's quite new to me, what's a structure I can use to support that conversation between the coachee and the line manager?
Sure. So, we sort of spoke around this idea of public goals and private goals. So, in the chemistry meeting with the coachees that I work with, one of the things that we will talk about is private and public goals. And following that session, I'll ask the coachees to go away and actually write up the private goals and the public goals for the coaching process. I want them to be in charge, actually, of this. So I will also encourage them to have a meeting with their line manager to discuss the public goals for the coaching before we come anywhere near the 3-way meeting. So something about preparing the coachee and normalizing it. I'll keep saying that. There's something around them thinking about how you prepare the line manager for the meeting. So, the reality is, unless they're the person, like the gatekeeper, that's bringing us in and we're having a conversation with them, quite often it might just be an email that we drop the line manager just to set out our expectations or the agenda for the 3-way meeting. And again, I think that's really important, because part of the 3-way conversation will be getting the coachee some feedback on how their leadership role is performing at the moment. And rather than when we get into the meeting, the leader's really prepared with all of these things that the coachee needs to do and are going wrong, and it can feel quite negative. There's that sort of balance around some validation of what the leader is doing well as where are there areas of growth. So I think prepare the coachee, prepare the leader, and then you need to have a decision around when you introduce this. So it may be at session 1. So say if in our process we're working with the leader for 2 hours in the first session, well, it may be that we have an hour with them, and then the leader will be joining for up to 30 minutes of the session. So we've got some time at the end to make sure that we debrief it with the coachee as well. So if I just continue, so Yeah, so in that hour before, we'll be sort of perhaps doing a bit more contracting and really discussing the private goals. But then also before that line manager joins or the HR, there's some questions that are useful to just help prepare the coachee for this. So questions to engage them in the outcome. What do you want to get from a three-way meeting? What questions do you have for your manager? Again, this isn't an exhaustive list. They're obviously depending on the situation, but some questions like this will be useful.
So I'm just noticing as you're talking that what's really occurring to me is those times when I've had a three-way contracting session, as you said, later on, so after session 2 or 3. And I notice that when I'm preparing the coachee, I'm finding myself saying to them, I'm still going to be the coach in this meeting. So I'm going to be coaching you and your manager to have a conversation. And I'm going to leave all the content with you. So it's up to you to share whatever you want to share. And I think that's really important, as you say, to really help them know that the boundary of confidentiality is still there. And it's in their, it's their choice to decide what's being shared and what's not being shared.
Yeah, and that's useful because I think the other part of preparing is ourselves and just making sure that we're taking ourselves into that place. I mean, we own the process, and I think sometimes we have to hold our authority in these meetings because often, perhaps it's a chief exec or it's a senior leader that's joining it who are used to being in control. There's something about us really setting the contract and the expectations early in the meeting. So, really connecting to our authority as well as our presence, I would say.
And actually, that feels like an important point to make, actually, because certainly for me, I always have a sense that I'm holding the meeting. So I will always kick it off. I'll always explain to the line manager and to the coachee, and I will facilitate the meeting. And so where all the content is there, it's very much, I have a sense that I'm sort of holding that process. Is that your experience as well?
Yeah, completely. And I think, by us role modeling that, again, it just sets the intention about the relationship going forward, that we're there to facilitate this conversation, but actually, they're going to be having ongoing conversations outside of this three-way meeting. So we need to perhaps set some expectations around things like updates and yeah, definitely. So, the meeting itself, I mean, again, this is just some examples of some ways that, we can start to facilitate this discussion. So I personally always find it useful to go to the coachee first because this is their coaching. So, invite them to share their thoughts on the public goals, in terms of what they believe they should be working on. And hopefully they've had this conversation with their manager before we're doing this. But sometimes, even if they do that, there's still sometimes a misalignment. And I think, the questions that we bring and the support that we bring is really useful around this because, the next question to the manager around, so let's hear your perspective on the public goals. And sometimes if they are very different, of course, we then need to facilitate a conversation between the coachee and the manager until we come to some sort of agreement. And sometimes as a coach, I might have to share my, bit of feedback. So I'm noticing, that this feels a bit of a stretch, in terms of what you're expecting. And I'm just wondering how realistic this is. Sometimes we might have to bring some challenge to the conversation. Obviously a conversation around how we measure the public goals, and then getting the feedback, as we said, where's the coachee now in relationship to these goals? What's working? What do they need to achieve? What's really vital in their leadership in terms of what they need to work on? So then we'll have some agreement around the goals, how we're going to measure them. And then it's an opportunity for, again, us facilitating this conversation. So what questions do you have? What support do you need? Really inviting this sort of dialogue. So the line manager is being brought into the process. It's not seen that this is something that the coach and the coachee are going to do. The line manager has a responsibility. And then there's a piece at the end around confidentiality. So just really reinforce that, we'll be meeting at the end, but between the meetings, you know, it's up to the manager and the coachee to be having ongoing conversations, and obviously reviewing the meeting as well. So that's just a skeleton framework. Of course, there might be many more questions depending on where we are. But then when the coachee leaves, the line manager leaves, you know, having an ample period of time with the coachee to debrief. Now, I know, Liz, one of the questions you ask is, you know, so were there any surprises? You know, what was new to you? What was useful? You know, it's wonderful sort of seeing the coachee and their line manager in conversation, because often it really gives you a sense of their relationship. And often, you know, if we've contracted for it with the coachee, we, you know, offering some feedback on how we experienced the coachee in that meeting is really useful. And then the final part will then be, you know, going back to the private goals. So this is what you said you wanted to work on. You know, based on that meeting, let's just check in on specifically, you know, whether anything's changed or not. So they're the sort of stages I would suggest. Of course, there's different variances of this depending on what's being discussed.
And I noticed what I'm sort of chuckling inside. So anybody who's listening in who's been on a program with us and done some of the ethical dilemmas, of course, this piece around being really explicit about where the feedback is going to come from is a really important part of the conversation, and also removes any of those lovely dilemmas we all sort of talk about, of the HR manager or the line manager saying, can we just have a conversation about an update? Because we've been really explicit about the only feedback that's going to come is going to come from the coachee. Mm-hmm. Yeah, lovely. Mm-hmm. So a couple of the questions we've had have been around, Mike put it really beautifully when he said any gotchas to look out for. So any things to be aware of, any challenges that we might face?
I think sometimes the line manager's availability, you know, depending on the level of seniority of the leader, especially if the leader is not feeling that they're being supported by the line manager anyway. So, you know, sometimes a line manager may be dialing in on video conference or phone just to make that work. So I think sometimes the coachee might say, well, it's going to be difficult to pin the line manager down. And I would say, again, this is where we need to hold true to the process, because there will be ways of doing that. So I think that's definitely one thing.
The other one I'm very aware of, I think, so Sarah, you've touched on it a little bit, and Kimberly, is this point again about, for me, I think there can be a gotcha if I start to get into a separate conversation with the line manager, because that's when I might be in a position where suddenly things are being told to me as the coach that the line manager is sort of perhaps hoping that I might be a bit of the messenger. Mm-hmm. So there's something about being really clear. So when I'm working with HR directors who are perhaps the buyers of coaching, as Damion said earlier, I'm really clear about what you said, which is, please don't tell me anything about this coachee that you're not happy to tell them, because otherwise I'm not sure what you're expecting me to do with it. And sometimes it takes a bit of time to, if you like, we're almost training the HR directors or other people that this is the process. And for me, actually, I try not to get into a separate conversation with a line manager, because, as you say, sometimes it can be, I can start to find myself in one of those situations where I'm not sure, you know, it's a bit like a game that I might be drawn into. So certainly that for me is a potential gotcha, just to be aware of.
Yeah, I was going to say, not preparing the line manager. So I remember last year experiencing, so the line manager hadn't read the email that I had sent him, actually, came into the coaching session, and let's just say I had to pick the coachee up after the three-way, because the way that the feedback was offered. And yes, I did sort of challenge them, and I asked them, so tell me about what's working at the moment. And the challenge was the line manager couldn't answer that question. So I think, you know, find ways of really ensuring you prepare the ground for this. I'd say it's definitely a gotcha.
And there's also something we always say this, that it's also a source of rich learning. So there's something about, we can never quite know what we're stepping into when we sort of step into an organisation or a contract with an organisation. And certainly my experience of three-way contracting is it's a really important step in trying to keep those relationships clean, if you like. So that I as the coach can do my best work, but also I can support both the organisation and the coachee.
I mean, I remember, just know it's true, because I remember one coachee of mine who was really assertive, and then when her manager came in, I mean, she shrunk. And I was watching this real parent-child dynamic, you know, and it offered me the opportunity to offer her some really useful feedback around what I was noticing about her in that meeting, and it had a profound impact on her outside. So really, so I think the other thing I'll just say is, you know, sometimes we might hesitate thinking that, you know, is this a dumb question to ask? And I would just say, you know, it's really important you ask the dumb questions. So an example is, you know, the line manager is saying things, oh, well, you know, we've discussed this already, or, you know, we spoke about this the other week. And, you know, it can be easy for the coach to just accept that that's the reality. So asking those dumb questions to the coachee, so how clear are you based on that conversation? They're really facilitating that conversation is useful.
Yeah, great. So we've covered a lot in the space of about 40 minutes around the importance of it, the benefits, how to, you know, a process for doing it, recognizing there are lots of other questions that would come in it for each of us individually, depending on how we run our three-way contracting. So let's just have a pause, give you a chance to think about what's resonated with you in this conversation, perhaps what questions have been answered for you, what questions might you still have, and what are you taking away? So just give you a couple of minutes for that. And please do feel free to share any on the chat panel. So thank you, Kim. So as you say, interesting to hear about the difference between public and private goals. So thank you for sharing that. Yeah, and Mike, about, as you say, helping to align the organisation and the relationship with the coachee. Yeah, so something about boundaries. Thank you, Kimberly, and the importance of holding the process. So yeah, it is, as we always say, this is one of the key areas where I, as the coach, I do own the process. So last slide, which is just some top tips. So Damion, do you want to talk about those?
Well, I mean, I think people can see those on the screen. It's really just a summary of for what we discussed. I mean, just picking up on one of the comments I can see from Nora, definitely if the line manager and the coachee relationship isn't strong, I mean, often we may be working with the coachee on their relationship with the line manager. I would always encourage at that point to speak to, you know, HR and see if they will be the sponsor of the relationship, or the coachee sometimes will have somebody else that they would want to bring in at that point. I think the key one from here is point 10, you know, remember you own the process. You know, we sometimes have to educate and really hold our authority around this being the right thing to do, especially if you know, the coachee is new to coaching, or perhaps the organisation are quite new to coaching. So I think they're really important. And
of course, the importance of supervision.
Definitely.
Because this is often a place where actually we can be in a relationship with someone, with a coachee, and suddenly realize that there's something else happening around us. So actually it's a really, supervision then can be a useful place to help us explore what else might be going on, and whether a three-way contracting conversation is going to help that. Great. So thank you very much. So just a couple of things to point to in terms of dates for the diary.
Yeah, so just to share that on the 10th of July, we're running our first sort of CPD event / conference for our alumni. So it's going to be in London. So just saying, hold the date in your diary. Some information will be coming out about this in the next 2 weeks. But during the day, you're going to have the option to choose to attend 3 2-hour CPD sessions. So we've been out to our alumni, and these are some of the topics they wanted to hear about. For example, real expert multi entrepreneurs going to be coming in to talk about how to develop an effective coaching business. A colleague of ours, Claire Allen, she'll be talking about how to develop an internal coaching provision and how to manage that. So, there'll be options around what you may want to attend. So just to mention that at the moment. The other thing will be our next coaching webinar. This is taking place on the 24th of March at 2:00 UK time. It's with an executive coach, Ruth Simpson. She's somebody I've known for a long time, and she's going to be talking about how to really coach a leader through a transition. So I'd really encourage you to dial into that one if you're working in that space too.